Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue talking about the aggregate expenditure model. And last time we finished up with saying that we were going to have this new curve. We had our original curve, which was the consumption function, and then we added investment onto that, and that shifted the curve up by the amount of the investment, and that gave us a new curve that we are now going to call the aggregate expenditure curve. And so here it is, the aggregate expenditure curve. And so the aggregate expenditure curve includes both consumption and investment, and then we compare that to the 45-degree line, which is where GDP is equal to aggregate expenditures. And you might think, well, aren't they always equal? And that's part of the purpose of this video, is to discuss the fact that they are not always equal. Also, I want to apologize on all these graphs that I created. I put consumption on that vertical axis. I did that on the very first one, and then I just copied and pasted over and over again, and I kept putting consumption up here. So going forward, I'm just going to tell you, if I forget to fix this, I'll try to remember. But if I forget, it's not just consumption anymore. It is now aggregate expenditures. So this vertical axis should be aggregate expenditures, which is both consumption and gross investment, measured on the vertical axis. So let's talk more about the difference between gross domestic product and aggregate expenditures. So the first thing to say here is that investment, gross investment, includes three things. Sorry about that. Gross investment includes three things: tools for production, that's capital; new construction; and changes in inventory. All three of those make up this gross investment. So that's important to begin thinking about this. And so recall then that this change in inventories here, that's going to be our big idea, and I think I said that on a previous podcast. That's going to be the big idea that we're going to highlight here. So let's think more about this. Gross investment is made up of two things, two new terms I'm going to start to use here, and they are planned investment and unplanned investment. Write the formula like this. This is planned investment right here, and this is unplanned investment, and you add those two together and you get your gross investment. So this gross investment, and I'm sorry, I'm cut off here at the end, this is aggregate expenditures is consumption plus gross investment. So this gross investment includes in it both the planned and unplanned investment. Okay? Now, why is that important? Because planned investment, so that's what it sounds like. Planned investment means that it was planned. Some companies were planning and investing in new capital. They were going to, maybe a textile company was going to buy new sewing machines. Maybe a restaurant was going to buy new ovens, whatever the case might be. And they planned for it. And then there would also be planned construction. So maybe a dental partnership is going to build a new dental office or something like that. That is planned construction. So these are planned. So remember, I said up here there were three parts to gross investment. They were the capital, that's planned. There was the new construction, that's planned. But now we have this other thing, changes in inventory. And sometimes our changes in inventory are unplanned. We didn't expect them. So that is what we call unplanned investment. Unplanned investment happens when your actual sales are greater than or less than what you planned. Okay? And if they're greater than or less than what you planned, then that's going to change the amount that you have in inventory. So really, this idea of unplanned investment really is just the idea of inventories. It's really just the idea of inventory. So let's do an example of this. So let's say a company has 300 units of some good in inventory. So that they produce some good, and they have 300 units sitting in inventory. That means they're on the shelf. They produced it, but no one's bought it yet. And you like to have some goods in inventory. It's really important to have some units in inventory because you never want a customer to come into your store and want to buy a product and you say, we're out of it. You don't want that to be your position. So you're always keeping some in inventory, maybe 300 units of some good. Okay? So let's say then that you produce. You want to keep 300 units in inventory. That's how many you want there. And then let's say that you produce an additional, let's say you produce 500 units of whatever this good is. Okay? You produce 500 units, and you expected the consumer to buy all 500 units. But let's say the producer, let's say that they consume, only 300 units. They consume 300 units. So now what has happened to your inventory? Well, you produced 500 units. Those 500 units got put on the shelf, so now you have 800 units. Oh, but wait a minute. All 500 don't actually go on the shelf because consumers bought 300 units of them. So, all right, if you produced 500 units of the good and the consumer buys 300 units of the good, that means that you're going to have 200 units left over that are going to get added to inventory. So you got 200 units that are now going to get added to the 300 that you already had in inventory. So now your new inventory is going to be 500 units. Now what that means is, your inventory, and remember I'm going to use another word here, that means your inventory or your unplanned investment increased by 200. That means your inventory or your unplanned investment increased by 200. And this, by the way, this could go the other way. If you produced only 100 units and the consumer bought 300 units, well, then the other 200 units would have to sell out of inventories, and then your inventories would go down instead of up. So that's what we call unplanned investment. That's what we call changes in inventory, and changes in inventory are going to be really, really important to the macroeconomic stories that we're going to tell, but we will think about that on a future podcast. So big idea on this is unplanned investment, changes in inventory. Those are going to be a big part of the story that we're going to tell in our macroeconomic models. And that is the difference between GDP and aggregate expenditures. And so I know you can't see this here. If I just move this over, this aggregate expenditures equals consumption plus gross investment. Yes, but we got to break this down, and we will do that on future videos because this gross investment is really planned and unplanned investment. We will talk about that on the future podcast. Thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan, and we'll see you on the next podcast.